Oh boy, another day, another James gets to make videos about Linux rant, I guess. I don't know. Hey everybody, how are y'all doing today? So last week was a pretty important day for Linux users because of a little company called RedHat. You might have heard of them. They're responsible for a lot of the Linux server infrastructure in the modern business world. They're also owned by IBM as of, I believe, 2019. Well, they came out with some stuff, and it's not good. They came out with some really kind of aggressive news that is going to offend a lot of people. So the big news is that RedHat is officially dropping support for their git.centos, or CentOS, however you pronounce that, .org repository. They got rid of that on June 21st of 2023, and they kind of did it very unceremoniously, and also isn't the first time that they have been kind of aggressive about their opinions towards CentOS. So the big takeaway here is that RedHat as a company has decided that they are no longer going to allow open source posting of their code unless it is by people who are licensed by RedHat, meaning that you have purchased a subscription for their software and you can access their customer portal. They claim that they do a lot of the development and everything in CentOS Stream as kind of the... I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. Let me take a step back here. So the main reason why this is a big deal is IBM bought RedHat in 2019. A year later, after CentOS 8 was a thing and it had a long-term release scheduled for 10 years. So 2018, 2019, I believe, until 2029 was their long-term support release window. So 2 years into that, RedHat comes out and just says, yeah, screw that, we're end-of-lifing RedHat 8 and CentOS 8, and all development is being shifted into CentOS Stream. CentOS Stream is more of a, how do I put this politely? It's a beta upstream or downstream. I forget what the terminology is. Basically, it's the code that will eventually end up in RedHat, but CentOS Stream is the first version of that code. So if you're on CentOS Stream, you're basically beta testing the code, then it gets hammered out and fixed, and then after a while when it's stable, it then makes its way into actual RedHat. So whereas before, CentOS was the same thing as RedHat, you just didn't get the support and you didn't get all of the other benefits that RedHat would provide. You just got the core OS. So obviously that got a lot of people's panties in a twist. Not only because they spent all this time deploying CentOS 8 in their infrastructure or building out solutions around CentOS 8 and then just had it pulled out from underneath them, it then switched to a model that wasn't the same model. So even if you did do the upgrade path to CentOS Stream, it's not a direct upgrade. Arguably, it's a downgrade in a lot of ways. You lose a lot of the stability, which RedHat is famous for. Now, there are arguments both ways for it, obviously. I want to point out that this appears to just be a business decision. It doesn't really... I feel like there's maybe one or two particular people at RedHat who might have some opinions otherwise, but on the whole, the way that I look at this is I'm looking at this as a business decision. This is not somebody who is just like, hey, fuck you guys, I got my free lunch, screw you. No, this is somebody who's making the decision of, well, we're giving away all of our best tricks, so we might as well charge for it. And like, I get that. It's understandable. In my opinion, it's a shit move because it's going to ruin the balance for how your company makes the money in the long term. So you're sacrificing long-term growth and stability for short-term profits. But I'm not a CEO, so I guess that's not my decision to make. And I also don't do any kind of high-level purchasing for a company of the size of RedHat. But that doesn't mean I don't have my opinions about it. So I had mentioned earlier that like the big takeaway is that you can no longer access their Git repo to get the code. You can get the actual Red Hat code, the actual source code. It's just now behind the paywall, so they now require you to have a license. That's one thing that I kind of wanted to talk about, because the licensing on Red Hat is kind of weird. So you have to have a Red Hat license. That they've come out in their blog post, and they have said, hang on, I'm trying to make sure this is the right one. So they came out in their blog post and basically said that this change does not signify any changes to CentOS itself. Red Hat customers and partners, source code made available. CentOS Stream will now be the sole repository for public RHEL related source code releases. So they didn't really go into details about like what you actually need in order to get the source code. They just said, hey, it's available in the customer portal, so if you have access to that, you should have the source code. Which I think that's a fair decision that they are totally able to make. Both philosophically, like you're allowed to do that, but also legally, GPL 3 absolutely allows them to do this. Like they don't have to just provide the source code to anybody. They have to provide the source code to their customers. And their customers are the people who are paying for Red Hat. So it doesn't matter what hoops they make you go through. You are a paying customer of them. You get their software. So like this is completely within their ability to do so. I'm not arguing about this as a licensing thing. Again, it's a dickhead move to make, but legally, they are completely within their right to do so. But the fun comes whenever you try to look at the licensing side. So in the updated post that came out 3 hours ago, as I'm recording this video, where he basically just put a lot of spin on it to make it sound a lot better than it was. You can very much feel the anger in this post about like how he's basically like, you should just be thankful that we're doing this at all, blah, blah, blah. I'm not getting into that right now. This is the part that I wanted to call out. We also provide no-cost Red Hat developer subscriptions and Red Hat Enterprise Linux for open source infrastructure. The developer subscription provides no-cost RHEL to developers and enables usage for up to 16 systems, again at no cost. This can be used by individuals for their own work and by RHEL customers for the work of their employees. RHEL for open source infrastructure is intended to give open source projects, whether or not they're affiliated with Red Hat in any way, access to no-cost RHEL for their infrastructure and development needs. So the way that this reads is like, if I'm trying to think of a good example, if LibreOffice, for example, wanted to support RHEL, they could just call Red Hat and be like, hey, we want some licenses, and they'll go, okay, here you go, here's some licenses, have fun. That's fine. The issue is that by doing this, they're deliberately trying to kill the downstream distros that are providing binary compatibility, bug for bug compatibility with the main Red Hat distro release. So like things like Rocky Linux and Alma Linux. They are open source projects. According to the wording here, they absolutely qualify for no cost Red Hat Enterprise Linux open source infrastructure licenses. Do they not? I don't believe that they will actually do that, but like according to the wording, they do technically qualify. OBS, for example, is probably another example where they could be like, hey, we want to make sure our code runs on RHEL as well as it does on other distros, and they'll be like, okay, here's some licenses. But then down here they say simply rebuilding code without adding value or changing it in any way represents a real threat to open source companies everywhere. Simply rebuilding code without adding value or changing it in any way represents a real threat to open source companies everywhere. This is a real threat to open source, and one that has the potential to revert open source back into a hobbyist and hackers-only activity. So, I want to be very careful with what I'm about to say here. This sentence right here, this is a threat to open source. That's very much playing the word game, like he was twisting words around to his benefit. This is not a threat to open source. This is literally the goal of open source. This is how open source works. This is a threat to open source being a viable business model, which is a different statement than what he is actually saying here. So I feel like it's very important to point that out, especially as we go into talking about the licenses. Okay, so I've danced around talking about the licensing situation for a little bit now. Let's actually dive into it. So they like I said, they kind of dangle this, oh, you can have it for free, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Let's actually talk about the real licensing. So from what I'm able to figure out, from spending way too much time on this page tonight, when I have other more important things to do, like drink and play video games, I think you can get away with just having one license and then gain access to the RedHat source code. So like if you are just one person who is just like, I'm literally just going to download the code and hit the recompile button. I'm not even going to put custom wallpapers or anything in it. Fuck you, RedHat. Technically you can do that. You pay for the one license and you get it. But there's a lot of caveats that they haven't really talked about how they're all going to fit together. So I think it's important to kind of explain how their licensing works first before we start to go into the philosophy of things. So they do all of their all of their licensing based on number of sockets and number of systems. So specifically socket pairs. So for every 2 pairs of sockets you have in your system, that is a license. For every physical system you have, that is a license. So if you have 10 physical systems that only have 1 socket each, that's only 5 socket pairs because there's only 1 socket. When you combine it all together, you only get 5 sockets, so you only need 10 subscriptions because you need a minimum of 1 license per physical system. So with this one, because we have 10 physical systems, same amount of physical systems, but all of them a dual socket, we have 10 socket pairs, that's still 10 licenses. So it's one or the other or both. So if you have a 4-socket system, so 2 4-socket systems, so that would mean that socket pairs are 4 because you have 2 4 in one server and 2 4 in another server. That's 4 total licenses. Even though it's only 2 physical systems, the socket pairs is 4. Same thing. So you got 2 systems, but they have 8 sockets. So that's 8 licenses you need. I hope all that makes sense. It looks pretty straightforward on paper, but trying to conceptualize the systems versus socket pairs thing can be a little weird. These are actually pretty favorable licensing terms, if I'm being frank. Like they're kind of looking at which number is bigger and just billing according to that. They're not doing evil things like what Oracle is doing or VMware even is doing, where they're doing per core licensing on systems. They're not going down that road. They're close with the socket pairs. That's a money grab as far as I'm concerned. But they're not being dickheads about it. They're just being dicks. Which, whatever, it's fine. They need to pay rent. It's okay. The other issue comes in whenever you add virtualization to it. And this is important for some of my points that I want to point out. So you basically get 2 virtual guests per license that you have. But these are an additional purchase. So like if you had one system that had 20 sockets in it, that's a 10 license subscription. Then you wanted to make it so that way each of that one system had 2 virtualization guests in addition to all the other stuff. That would be a purchase of another 2 additional licenses. If you wanted it to have 20, that would be 1 additional license, because for every 1 license you get 2 virtualization guests. You see how complicated this can get if you're not like looking at like a flowchart? I'm trying to like think of like all of the situations for like how to get around this and like the cheapest way to get access to the source code. So like I believe that what you could do is you could get away with just 1 license. You have 1 system, that's 1 socket, blah, 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 you get the source code. The problem is at that point, what do you do with it? Because if you have any kind of infrastructure whatsoever, so like let's say that you have your workstation, like this machine that I'm on right now, and then you have a build server. You push your code to the build server to compile every night or every week or whatever. Does that build server now need a license in order to access the source code? Like it shouldn't, right? According to the paper here, because you're not actually installing RedHat on that computer. You're just using it to build. So like you shouldn't need a license, but in order to have access to the source code, you need a license, but you own that machine, but that machine's not licensed for RedHat. So where does that fall? So let's look at it from another perspective. So let's say that it's you and a friend, and you have a virtualized build machine that you do on your local workstation. So that would be 3 licenses you'd have to have, right? The other person definitely needs to have a license because they need to be able to, run the code and everything. In order to see the code, they need a license. But then you'd have to buy an extra license. You'd have to buy an extra license to do virtualization on your machine. So there would be 3 licenses minimum. But if he was doing a build machine as well, like a local build machine, and you didn't have a physical build machine, and you both are doing local builds in VMs, that would be 4 licenses, right? Because is this just the number of guests total that you get, and then you just divide it by 2, and that's the number of licenses? So I can use 2 virtual machines on different things? Because they do show some examples here, but they don't really go into a whole lot of detail, and it's you kind of just have to talk to people and be like, this is what I need, and they'll just be like, okay, here's the here's the money, or here's the invoice, check please. You guys kind of have to take their word for it, because okay, so this example is going to have, so we've got 10 4-socket systems, so that's 40 licenses, and then in order to get 80 guests to run on those, that's also 40 licenses. But what happens if I want to, I guess I can just run the virtualization licenses on anything as long as it's licensed for Red Hat, right? So there would be 2 licenses for my system and my buddy's system, and then we would pay for 1 additional license, which would let us do 2 VMs, and because both of our systems are licensed, we can do that. That's fine. But then what happens if... Well, no, actually, a better way to do it would be that you would just have the one center build system that you have a license for, and then pay for an additional license to give you 2 VMs that you both remote into to do all of your work on the source code for, and then the host machine is what does the build. That would be only 2 licenses. That would be only 2 licenses required. So that'd be a cheaper way to get 2 people, and you'd get 3 machines. Do you understand my point now about how complicated and crazy this licensing situation is? Imagine how much this problem scales. If you're somebody who has you're working on a project that's got 10 people. Do each of you need a license? Can we get away with just doing the central build server thing and then just keep adding virtualization licenses and everyone remote in to work? That sounds awful. That sounds like a horrendous dev environment, but it's cheaper. So will people have to do that? I don't know. It's so unclear. And when you read their blog post about things, I really don't think they're going to allow that use case. The generally accepted position that these free rebuilds are just funnels churning out RHEL experts and turning into sales just isn't reality. I wish we lived in that world, but it's not how it actually plays out. Instead, we found a group of users, many of whom belong to large or very large IT organizations that want the stability, lifecycle, and hardware ecosystem of RHEL without having to actually support the maintainers, engineers, writers, and many more rules that create it. These users also have decided not to use one of the many other Linux distributions. All right, so this is a loaded statement for many reasons. So right away, they're making it clear that okay, this is a decision that we're doing based on money, which, as we saw in the licensing thing, very clear what they're doing. But then they turn around and throw this kind of backhanded slap, with these last 2 sentences, without having to actually support the maintainers, engineers, writers, and many more rules that create it. Yeah, obviously they want that. But the real issue is that a lot of software is kind of designed for Red Hat. You would be kind of irresponsible to run something like CentOS Stream as your production environment, because it doesn't have that stability that Red Hat does. So yes, people want that stability. That's why they run things like CentOS. And I'm sure a lot of people are more than happy to pay for the software side of things. You just don't give them a way to do that without going down the RHEL route and the crazy, insane licensing and just paying out the nose for features that a small shop may not want. Think about a small business with 12 employees. They might have a Linux guy who grew up with CentOS and is yeah, absolutely, the Red Hat is where you want to go for stability. They straight up can't do that now. Even if they were willing to pay a few $100 for a license, they would have to actually migrate to RHEL, and then there's no telling what their recurring monthly fees are or anything. I couldn't really find much information on that. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but Red Hat's, it's very much a you have to talk to sales kind of thing is the vibe I'm getting. And it just pushes those customers out. But then they sit here and they talk about how, oh, those are the poor engineers. Like we need to pay them. And it's like, okay, well, give some customers a way to give you more money. I guarantee you'd get some sales that way. Like, fuck, I know, like, in my professional life, the only reason I have CentOS experience, RHEL experience, is because of our old server infrastructure that we don't use anymore. And, like, specifically reasons like this. Like, I just, like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't get it. Like, this really just feels like a money grab. And given that it's very shortly after the IBM acquisition that CentOS first died, and now we're just seeing more and more of the death throes of it. It's getting harder and harder to believe that this isn't something that Big Blue is forcing down everyone's throat. The thing that really bothers me though is that they throw in this kind of, like, we're talking about backhanded comments. Let me see if I can find the exact thing right here. I want to specifically mention the rebuilders, different from distributions that might, for example, add a new architecture or compile flag. We fully support you in expanding Linux capabilities rather than imitating them. So, if somebody took RHEL and ported it to Apple's silicon chips, for example, okay? They're okay with that. Port it to RISC-V. They're okay with that. The cynical side of me says they're absolutely okay with that because then they can just take your code and pull it into their distro and profit from it. But I mean, they're also kind of sitting here and saying that Alma Linux and Rocky Linux don't actually bring anything to the table other than the fact that they downloaded the RHEL source code and hit the compile button, which for the vast majority of the project, sure, I can't argue that, but it's not that they put zero effort into it. There's definitely effort put into it. I can't speak much to, like, obviously adding a new architecture is a very complicated thing to do. Compile flags, I don't really feel like are that in the same league. They might be, I don't know. I'm sure that can also be very complicated, but, like, this is another statement that just feels very backhanded. The generally accepted position that these free rebuilds, I already read that line. It makes me so mad that every time I see it pop up, I just need to read it again because it makes me so mad. Simply rebuilding code without adding value or changing it in any way represents a real threat to open source companies everywhere. There it is. He finally said the quiet part out loud. Open source companies. This is a real threat to open source, one that has the potential to revert open source back into a hobbyist and hackers only activity. Yeah. No, I don't agree, but whatever. The last thing that I wanted to say before I end off this video, because this is kind of just turning into a not really fond of Red Hat moment right now. Fairly popular. I was gonna say somewhat popular. He's fairly popular YouTube creator, Jeff Geerling. He is a big component behind me learning certain things like Ansible and seeing the crazy stuff that he's done. He has officially said that in his open source work, he is no longer going to be supporting Red Hat because they're just making it really difficult for him to do so. And, like, I get it. Like, keeping up the licensing and everything, like, that's going to be a huge amount of work for him for, like, no benefit because he can't use it himself. The thing that bothers me is that I'm seeing a lot of people say online that, like, oh, this is just, he's just speaking from emotion and trying to get the clicks and blah, blah, blah. No, some people actually just, like, are able to look past their business relationships and actually, like, realize, like, wow, these guys kind of suck. And that's Jeff's opinion, you know? Again, I'm not really gonna sit here and say that, like, he's definitely using the situation to his benefit. Do not misunderstand me. But I think it's kind of an important thing to note that somebody who is very big into open source and very big into another one of IBM's products, Ansible, is publicly decrying what they're doing. That should at least give you some pause to be like, okay, maybe there's some credence here. I don't really think he's just shouting into the void. Maybe I should at least look this up for myself. And again, the comments from them today feel very poignant and very agenda based. I don't really get the same feeling from Jeff. Like, I really feel like this is just a guy who likes Linux and is kind of pissed off at Red Hat because Red Hat is being a dick. Like, If you're sitting here trying to deny that Red Hat is being an asshole with what they're doing, that's fine. You're allowed to that opinion. They're being an asshole. You can think that they're right, and you can still think that they're being an asshole. Just put that out there. And it's kind of sad, seeing this is the first fruits of Red Hat's labors. Obviously, this is like not really that big of a deal, but this is the same side of the coin that caused the kerfuffle with CentOS Stream. Like I said, there are a lot of companies that are dropping support for Red Hat as a whole because they just straight up do not have a way to get to the same thing of Red Hat because Red Hat doesn't view their business as worth it. And like, it just kind of amazes me that a lot of people, especially on Hacker News, were just completely oblivious to that fact. That like they just couldn't see the same relationship between CentOS and what they're doing, or the first steps they did with CentOS and these follow-up steps. Just like I saw people unironically recommending people use CentOS Stream, which is a horrific idea, even for a daily OS. Like I would rather use Arch at that point than using CentOS Stream. Like I don't get it. People use Red Hat for the stability and they use it for the expertise that they have. If they're not getting that, then there's like, if you take both of the benefits away from it, then there's no reason to use it. And people get offended when you say that. I don't know why. But yeah, this is going to be just a really quick video. I just wanted to talk about this and mention that I'm kind of really upset with Red Hat. They are doubling down on some business decisions that they are well within their right to make. I just think that they're short-sighted because they want short-term corporate gain rather than long-term what's best for the community and what's best for their users. The good news is that for now, Alma Linux and Rocky Linux have announced that they are going to keep moving forward. It's just the way forward is very much in a question right now. So we'll see how it all goes. Thank you guys for sitting here listening to me rant a little bit about shady business practices. And I guess we'll see you next week.